Hi everyone. Yes, I'm Richie, and I'm going to be taking you through how we can make economic arguments for animals. So, who remembers this bus? Oh, yes, this bus. Right. So, depending on your political beliefs, this bus was either the ticket to freedom from Europe, or this bus caused the train wreck that we now find ourselves in. But whether you like it or love it, you have to admit that this bus worked. The idea that we send £350 million to Europe every week, as if it was going in a big duffel bag, right, carried over the Dover crossing, and we give it to Europe when instead we could be funding our struggling NHS, was a message that really resonated with people. People care about public spending, they care about how much money our institutions have, and they care about whether our governments waste money, right, in their perception. Right, raise your hand if you know who Rachel Reeves is. Yes, okay. But you probably didn't know who she was a year ago, right? But everyone is talking about Rachel. In fact, over 2 days last week, I counted 6 articles about her in The Guardian. And people are very interested in her, what she thinks, what she's going to do. And the reason for that is because she is our Chancellor of the Exchequer. She is responsible for our budget, and in many ways, she is in the driver's seat for the UK economy. And so people are extremely interested, hopeful, or worried about what she is going to do. She's under a lot of kind of scrutiny and criticism. There's a lot of discussion, right? What she says and does matters in the eyes of the public. And the reason for this is that for policymakers and the public alike, the economy is important. In fact, the economy is king. And if you have an initiative, a project, an organization, if you want to change the country, then you're going to get a lot more traction and you're going to get a lot more attention from people in power if you can make economic arguments in favor of your ideas. Now, economic arguments is a very vague term, but 3 things I like to talk about are boosting gross domestic product, or GDP. This is a simple metric we use to measure how well our economy is doing. It's used to judge whether we're in a recession or not. It's about creating jobs, right? If your policy creates jobs, good. If your policy destroys jobs or puts people out of jobs, bad, very bad, right? And if your policy saves money for government institutions, if it saves money for British households, then people are going to listen to you. So before I go any further, I want to kind of give us some caveats here. This talk is very pragmatic in its approach, right? So I'm going to talk about how economic arguments are important, but I kind of wish this wasn't the case. I think a lot of us wish the economy wasn't as important in the eyes of many people as it is. But unfortunately, this is the reality we live in. Of course, the economy is not the only important thing. There are many, many more important things, like in how we should structure society. But again, this is something that people really care about. And for the more kind of economically astute among you, you might be saying, "Oh, GDP." It's a terrible metric. It doesn't measure this, that, and the other. And you're right. It's a flawed metric, but again, it is a metric that we use and care about. And lastly, we probably have some socialists in the audience. We might have some socialist sympathizers or people with that flavor of politics. Nothing wrong with that. But I kind of want to emphasize in this talk that this is not really kind of the place for this wider debate about socialism versus capitalism, whether the vegan movement needs to be socialist, whether a capitalist veganism can work. Those are kind of quite big debates and very interesting ones, but I would like to kind of have those in the pub maybe after this, and keep the Q&A more focused on the content. So I thought I'd start with something that we get asked a lot at Bryant Research, which is like, what about a meat tax, right? If we tax meat, will that solve all of our problems? And I say that a meat tax is the best, worst solution to all of our problems. So if we taxed meat, it would become more expensive, right? And if it's more expensive, people will buy less of it, and then less animals will be killed, right? And this is appealing, and it is the best solution in that it's widely considered among economists that a meat tax would work, right? It could be very, there are many conditions under which it would be very effective, but it is also the worst solution in that the public absolutely hates it. We have done polling on this, but you can just ask people. The idea of a meat tax is political suicide, and in fact, politicians will attempt to smear each other by like implying that another politician has suggested a meat tax, even if they haven't, right? And you see politicians like Labour politicians scrambling to say, no, we never mentioned anything about a meat tax, because they realise it can be kind of used against them, even if it was never on the discussion table. But factory farming, the problem I see here is that factory farming has kind of monopolized the economic narrative, right? So the whole point of factory farming is that through efficiencies and economies of scale, factory farming allows us to deliver cheap meat to consumers, saving consumers money on their food bills. And this is a powerful narrative that factory farming uses to kind of keep itself front and center in a kind of agricultural system. But something I kind of want to talk about is that the costs of an industry are not just paid at the supermarket tills. The costs are often hidden, and they are borne by society later. And that money, when costs are incurred elsewhere, they still have to be paid, either by future generations or by institutions, or through government borrowing or things like that. And so I think we as animal advocates need to fight back. We need to fight fire with fire. We need to kind of start making economic arguments of our own, and I have a few in the toolbox. So before I get into them, a lot of you, do we have any economists in the house? I don't think so. I'm not an economist either, and no one at Bryant is either, right? And so you might think, oh wait, who's he to be giving this talk? But that's actually kind of the point here, which is that people think that economic arguments can only really be made by economists. They think it's this discipline full of complex equations and dynamical systems models, and that no one else is allowed to really touch this topic. But that's not true, right? There are simple ways we can make these arguments. There are compelling ways we can make these arguments without having to learn complex math. And I kind of want to encourage you all to experiment with how you might make these arguments yourself. So the first one is a report that I wrote a while back with the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation. If you whack open your phone and get your camera out and kind of scan over that QR code, it should take you to the report. There's going to be a lot of these QR codes, by the way, so keep your phone handy. So what we wanted to do here is we wanted to quantify. So we know that plant-based diets are good for our health. Reducing meat would make the average British person much healthier. And the thing is that translates into cost savings for the NHS. And the NHS is, of course, funded by the government, which it comes from your taxes, right? And so we might be able to save taxpayers money, save the NHS money by encouraging meat reduction, right? So what did we find? We found that even modest meat reduction can save the NHS billions annually in health costs. So, for example, a 20% reduction in meat, which is something like a couple of burgers a month, right, could save the NHS 1.23 billion pounds. Going vegetarian for your weekday lunches, right, something as kind of small scale as that could save us 2.21 billion pounds a year. And around about the same time, the Vegan Society also commissioned a bit of research. That was actually done by economists. And luckily for me, the numbers match up quite well with what I found, so that's quite validating. But they basically found that if the entire UK population went vegan, the NHS could save 6.7 billion pounds a year. And okay, so you might think, wow, we're talking billions of pounds. That sounds like a lot of money. But is that actually a lot of money? We don't really know. With economics, you hear about a billion here and a billion there, and pretty soon we're talking about real money, right? And so it's to kind of put that into context. That's like saying a vegan society could save us, the NHS, as much money to pay basically the salary of 185,000 nurses. So you've got this headline here: a vegan society could fund 185,000 more nurses. Grounding your kind of these cost savings in real world things can be quite compelling, because I think that's pretty compelling. So how did we do it? How might you do something similar yourself? Well, firstly, we researched major diseases that were linked to overconsumption of meat. And then we also researched the diseases that are most costly to the NHS, because some diseases cost the NHS more than others. And the key thing here is that we could have done some analysis where we looked at every single disease that afflicts our kind of society, every disease that has been linked to meat consumption, and then made some giant complex thing. But it's usually unnecessary to do that, because in a lot of these systems we have kind of what you can apply what's called the 80-20 principle, which is just the idea that something like 80% of the cost of the NHS are going to come from 20% of the diseases, right? So, you see this all through society. 80% of crime is committed by like 20% of people, and things like that. So you can kind of shortcut a lot of this analysis and get a very good rough number just by focusing on, right, what are the most expensive diseases and what are the ones that are most affected by meat consumption. So we settled on cancer, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes. We basically read a bunch of academic reviews and then just whacked it all into a spreadsheet and multiplied it out. It was kind of that simple. So the next one I want to talk about is one by the Green Alliance. They're not a vegan org, they're a climate org, but they do fantastic work, really good reports. I'm not going to spend too long on this because I didn't write this report, but basically the headline of this is that if we invest appropriately into our domestic alternative protein industry, we could create 25,000 new jobs in food by 2035. So they wrote a paper about basically how the UK should lead the emerging alternative proteins market and all the economic benefits we could realize from that. And it's a pretty good read. I would encourage you to read it. So the next one is another report that I wrote with the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation. So big up Chris and Lorraine Platt if you're watching this on YouTube. And we wanted to directly take aim at factory farming. So we know that factory farming, you probably all know that factory farming has hidden costs to our society, right? And we wanted to make those costs more concrete by putting some pounds and pence on them, right? And particularly relate that to what taxpayers kind of have to pay. So we chose, again, this 80-20 thing. We could have picked a number of things, but we went with 4 different things. The headline up there is that factory farming costs the UK economy our estimate is 1.2 billion a year. So, it's over $1 billion, so that's quite a lot. The first thing we looked at is subsidies. So polling shows that, we give farmers lots of subsidies in the UK, right? In Europe as well. And polling shows that the British public thinks that this is fine, this is good. We should be giving farmers subsidies, and especially if they're financially struggling. But we also found in polling that a lot of the UK population supports the idea that factory farmers shouldn't get any subsidies at all. They should be ineligible for subsidies, right? And that's a pretty cool thread to pull on. So we thought we'd try and calculate how much of UK agricultural subsidies go towards factory farmers, right? And then we can, plaster that all over the internet and get people really angry. And we found that it was we estimated about £269 million a year. And what's interesting about this is that this is really hidden, because in the UK you don't get subsidies per chicken or per pig or per cow. Or even how much meat you produce. You get subsidies usually, or at least up until recently, you mostly got subsidies based on kind of the amount of land you owned. So what's happening here is about 40% of UK grains are fed to farm animals, and we subsidize the production of those grains. So in effect, we are indirectly subsidizing factory farming by basically making their inputs cheaper, right? So this is basically almost a hidden subsidy in a way, and we wanted to kind of bring that to light. The next thing we looked at is environmental pollution. So factory farms generate tons of waste. That waste ends up in rivers, it pollutes the rivers, it ends up in the air, it pollutes the air. That costs a lot of money. Simple. You might have heard about the River Wye is currently dying. It faces complete collapse because of the factory chicken farms we've been putting up all along its banks. So we estimated the cost of this to be £518 million a year. Next up, we wanted to estimate public health costs. So these are, this is not about like the NHS report. This is not the cost of eating too much meat. This is the public health cost specifically to rural communities who live near factory farms. And because they live near these polluting kind of industrial units, they suffer from worse respiratory health, COPD, asthma, kind of lung disorders. And this can actually translate into additional deaths in rural communities. So we wanted to kind of calculate the health costs of that. We got about 91.7 million, so nearly 100 million. And lastly, we wanted to talk about lost jobs. So the thing about factory farming is almost by definition, it's about automating agriculture. And the thing about automating agriculture is it's destroying farming jobs. That's how we should be framing it. Factory farming is directly destroying farming jobs, whereas factory farms often claim that they are job creators for rural communities, right? And that is wrong. That is not true. And so we wanted to put some money on this to draw attention to it. And the way we did this is I analysed, I kind of estimated the number of jobs in British agriculture lost between 1990s to the early 2020s from factory farming. Estimated it to be about 14,000 farming jobs kind of gone. And when you multiply that by the average salary, essentially you get the salaries that were not earned, the money that was not generated in rural communities, that was not spent in rural shops, that was not used to fund rural councils. And that number came in at about 333 million. So how do we do this, and how might you do something similar? Well, this one was quite ambitious actually. There's nothing stopping you from doing one component of that, right? We did like 4 things. Doing one of those things can be very, very valuable. Some ways we did it is, for example, we relied a lot on government statistics, right? So the government actually has, when making policies, it has the cost of pollution. It says if your policy generates this many tons of pollution, it needs to generate this much economic value, like this many thousands of pounds in economic value for it to be worth pursuing, and so we can use that as essentially a cost of pollution in effect, right? For estimating lost jobs, we used the wages not paid. There are other ways you could have done it. We use lost paid. Subsidies you can find on the government website, but other animal orgs have also done some great work on unearthing subsidies. For the rural economy, we kind of went at this a bit of a funny way. We basically used so healthcare systems basically value human life. They calculate the value of a human life. It's called the value of a statistical life. And that sounds dystopian, but this is kind of how healthcare systems work. And so one estimate is that a human life is worth about $4.7 million to the NHS. And so essentially, if factory farming causes the death of a person, then we can, with a few assumptions, we can basically pin a $4.7 million bill on factory farming for that death. And kind of what I want to get across there is you might have some concerns, or you might not like the way we measured some of those things. There are multiple ways we can measure these things, but and that's great. We can measure these things in different ways, but I think the key thing here is to work with what you have. And that when these things have not been estimated before, even getting a first estimate can be very, very valuable. It can start the conversation going. Someone can come along and do a better job than me and refine those estimates and update those estimates. And we get that research program going. It gets the public conversation going as well. So lastly, I want to talk about a report that was done by Brian, but not by me. This was by our very own Billy Nichols, who is in the front row supporting me. Yeah, he also had a fantastic talk with Andrew Knight on vegan pet food that some of you might have had. And he did this in collaboration with plant-based universities. And this is basically about how much money the university caterers could save by adopting the plant-based universities pledge by transitioning to all plant-based catering in universities. So the headline findings for this that are kind of relevant to us, I think they did some stuff on climate, but the big one for us is basically that they calculated food costs, like costs of different meals, and they kind of found that vegetarian meals tend to cost caterers 30% less than meat-based meals, And the vegan meals were 21% cheaper than even the vegetarian meals, right? We have a clear kind of financial argument for a plant-based transition. And they didn't stop there. They didn't just say like, oh, vegan meals are cheaper, because to some extent we know that, right? But they went one step further and they made it directly useful to the institutions. And they calculated things like a medium-sized university of 10,000 students could save up to £500,000 annually just on the cost of the food in their catering outlets, right? By adopting a 100% plant-based university catering. So even though plant-based universities, they go with the climate angle, and that's very persuasive, we're adding an additional tool to their box. We're kind of giving them, and we're giving universities another reason to take this seriously, and one that might appeal to a different set of stakeholders that may not have been convinced by the sustainability kind of argument, right? And so the key lesson of this one is that, yes, Billy, like all of us at Bryant, Billy is not an economist, but in fact, he is a history graduate, and so if even plucky arts grads can do work like this, and read the report, it is great, it's really good, and so if even arts grads can do that, then I'm sure some of you can do it too, right? Like, I want you to know that this kind of stuff is possible for all of you. But let's just say that even the idea of opening a spreadsheet kind of sends you into a panic attack. Can you still use economic arguments in your advocacy? Well, I think yes, you can. And something I'm kind of excited by is what we might call economic stories. Because when we say that we're saving institutions money or creating jobs, right? Those policies, those economic policies, have people, real people, underneath them, and we can tell those stories in a powerful way, right? So you might hear about cuts to disability benefits, and you might say, oh, this many thousand people are going to see their benefits slashed by 10%. And that's an important analysis to run, but it also needs to be accompanied by the stories of real disabled people who are now facing, like, describing their food hardship because we have cut their benefits, right? Those kinds of stories can galvanize people more than the modeling, although often having the modeling in the background can make those arguments kind of land more. So I've kind of come up with some ideas of things I would like to see. I phrased them in this, I don't know if these things are true, but the idea is that you don't necessarily need to do economic modeling. You can go out and interview people, right? And the idea here is, so these are kind of things that to kind of get your ideas, to get your mind firing. So for example, imagine a story in The Guardian. A new factory farm opened down the road, and now my home is worthless, right? So a big polluting factory farm that stinks, and it's got lorries constantly coming in and out of it, and the constant sound of clucking and death basically has ruined someone's house price, right? We could tell that story, and then people could see that and get angry at factory farming. They might resist the development of a factory farm in their area where they wouldn't otherwise, out of concern over their house prices. Or local council used up £5 million of your taxes to clean up factory farms' mess, right? This is something, imagine that in a local rural newspaper that residents could then take their council to account over. Or one that's a bit more welfarist, beloved local organic pig farmer shuts down after 20 years, we just can't compete with cheap factory farmed garbage, right? Here, we're basically taking factory farm, and instead of positioning it as the saviors or the bulwarks of rural communities, we're directly pitting them against other farmers, rather than it being kind of vegans versus farmers, which is, as we've heard, is a losing narrative, to be honest. We're pitting big corporate factory farms against small farms that small scale farms that the UK public kind of supports even more. So in summary, plant-based diets can save cash-strapped institutions money through cheaper food and lower healthcare costs. Factory farming has tons of hidden costs, from stolen subsidies to air and water pollution to destroyed jobs. And alternative proteins can create thousands of future-proof, rewarding jobs for our economy. Whereas factory farming eliminates jobs. So in conclusion, the economy is very important to policymakers and the general public alike. There are good economic arguments against factory farming, and we should be making them. There are good economic arguments for plant-based diets, and we should be making them. But we should also be exploring more of them. I don't have all the answers. Some of this research has only been done in the last few years. I would really love to hear your ideas, see kind of your efforts to do this too. We should be exploring more of these economic arguments through both kind of more formal modeling, but also the telling of economic stories. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do I stay up here?
If you want to.
I'll stay up
here.
I'll have a sit first, but yeah.
So we have time for one quick question. So what are the conditions in which economic messages work or don't work? Advocacy groups have done work on economic costs of obesity, smoking, alcohol, climate change, etc., but they don't always generate radical policy change, e.g. findings about the huge cost of the climate inaction don't seem to be driving sufficient policy action.
Yeah, so it's a very good question, because economic arguments are made by numerous social justice kind of causes. So, for example, with the long-term cost of climate change, the thing about economic arguments is that the reason they resonate with people is not because they care about the economy in some abstract sense, it's because they care about their job, their food bills, their local kind of economy, their high street, right? And so when you say climate change is going to do $2 trillion in damage in 30 years, the response there is yeah, but what's that going to do to me? People find it, obviously it will do something to you, but it can be very hard to visualize that. So the idea is to tie it directly back to the people reading your report. In terms of where these messages land a bit better. So for example, some of this research was commissioned by the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation. So these messages do work with liberals and conservatives alike. But for example, both my reports were covered in the Daily Express, and favourably in the Daily Express, and endorsed by Conservative MPs and Lord Goldsmith. And they covered this positively, which is very unusual for pieces in our movement. For context, the Daily Express is like a right-wing newspaper, and I'd be surprised if they ever say anything nice about vegans ever. So these messages land particularly well with conservatives, but it's not just limited to conservatives. For example, Labour is on this big economy is the only thing that matters kind of agenda at the moment. So we would expect those arguments may resonate with those policymakers as well. You also want to target institutions that don't have any money, right? The NHS doesn't have any money, so we would expect them to be a bit more open. Whereas if you target kind of institutions that are a bit more flush with money or doing very well, they may be less receptive to those arguments.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Richie. Big round of applause.
Thank you, everyone.